The first thing I want to jump into are some of those 101 concepts that, like I said, may be familiar to folks, but may not be. Let me share screen for a second here. So 3 concepts that if you work in advocacy and legislative stuff, you're already somewhat familiar with this, but you may not be deeply familiar with it. And if you've never been on the side of organizing testimonies or following a bill from start to finish, then some of this might be new, but it's really foundational, really helps clarify some things. The first concept is the calendar. So in Washington State, we have alternating long sessions and short sessions. And this year was a long session, which means it was about 3, not quite 4 months, or not quite 4 months, during which our legislative body, our state Senate and our state Congress can put forward bills and have them go through the committee, have them go through the whole process. But to understand what's happening at any given moment, what I like to do is check out the link that they provide on the Washington State Legislature's website. I'm going to open it right now. Are people seeing something that says 2023 session cutoff calendar? Great. So this is just the calendar for this year. The first day of session was January 9. And you'll notice there are these things where it will say something like last day to read in committee reports in the House of Origin, except House Fiscal Committees and Senate Ways and Means and Transportation Committees. Last day to read in committee reports from House Fiscal Committees and Senate and Ways and such. Last day to consider or pass bills in House of Origin. These are the dates that people often refer to as like cutoffs. And sometimes it's used really broadly and imprecisely, but I think there's actually precise things that are cutoffs and things that aren't. But what this tells you, essentially, when you look at this, and I'm not going to run through every item on this, but I just want to give you a sense. Because much like our federal Congress, bills have to pass in both houses before they're signed by the governor, just like you have to get something passed in the House and the Senate before the president passes it. There are specific dates at which the bill has to be introduced. It's sort of the like, speak now, forever hold your peace moment. This year for committee reports or getting things out of committee or onto the record on the floor of a particular house, that date was February 17. That meant that, and it says in House of Origin. So a bill that was going through, that had to do with transportation, for example, and was going through the House Transportation Committee. This was a date that everyone was looking at to essentially make sure that it got onto the record and on the floor of the House in that. And then February 24, a week later, then it had to go through all the financial weight. I actually said transportation, which is wrong. Transportation is one of the few exempted committees. If it was public safety, for example, right? It would have to get through and get scheduled and made available for the greater House of Origin to discuss and vote on and all of that. Then you have the financial committees. So the House Fiscal Committees and Ways and Means and Transportation, I'm not actually sure why transportation is pulled out, but these are essentially the committees that decide things like, that help figure out like, what is this going to cost? What is the impact of this? Let's discuss this in terms of dollars and cents, or at least that's kind of the theory behind it. And so they get a bit more time after a bill has been cooked to consider it. And then finally, March 8 is when the House, that is the State House, the State Senate, that came up with this bill, that put it through its committee process, that put it through its financial committee process, they have to consider it by March 8, 5 p.m., which basically means get it essentially on the, before it gets all the financial stuff. This is like the first cutoff that people would talk about often. And if it didn't make its way through that part of the process by March 8, then it was considered like a missed opportunity. A lot of people would say, oh, well, now it's dead. You'd hear people refer to as bill dead at that point. But then, of course, if it made it through all of that process, then the next thing it had to get through for House of Origin is all those financial committees again, right? And that was March 29. So sometimes, and I'm sort of just barreling through this, and we can get into more detailed questions in a second, but sometimes you hear people talk about like, oh, it's a cutoff for this bill to get out of committee, or it's a cutoff for this bill to get onto the floor. And these are the dates that we're talking about. And we've created in the legislature these speak now moments to make sure that bills can get through the process of being considered by their house of origin and then considered by the opposite house, so from the House to the Senate or the Senate to the House, and be evaluated through the committees that are meant to consider them and be evaluated through the financial committees before they're eventually voted on. And you see this process then repeat, getting onto, essentially getting read into committee and then getting into the, except for transportation and financial committees. And then you have the financial committees deadline, and then you had the third consideration deadline once it's been through all that. And you see that repeat again for the opposite house. And then finally, I believe the sort of main date that people looked at for a lot of this would be, we have April 12th, where things from the opposite house, if they got through the first house, they got through, say, state Senate, and then they were shown to the state house. April 12th is like the speak now forever hold your peace date. After that, it's a lot of votes, and then the session ends on April 23. And it's not a lot of dates, but if you've never seen this before, it can be a little bit confusing. They also provide this calendar every session, and you can also check it out as a PDF, where they break it down by the date, the day of the week, and the day of session. And you can kind of look at it this way, which is a little bit easier, and you can see how fast the dates actually come based on this calendar. And then there are notes like the governor has 5 days if the legislature is still in session, or 20 days if they've adjourned to take action on any bill that they've passed, things like that. So that's like the quick overview of what the calendar looks like. And I'm curious, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, and I'll put the links to that in the chat. If people ever looked at this before, is this familiar to you, or is this new information?
I just learned it this year. So it was good review. Thank you.
Nice. I put the PDF in the chat. I'm going to put the other link in the chat. Does anyone have any questions or anything that they want to add, honestly, clarifying this? I'm going to be honest with you. This is my first time trying to explain this to a group of people who I haven't been doing this work with the whole time. So this is a new opportunity for me to see how strongly I grasp all of this as well.
I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So I noticed that there were a number of bills that in the House of Origin passed through the Policy Committee, passed through the Fiscal Committee, and then got sent to something called the Rules Committee. And my understanding is the Rules Committee has to be the one that puts it out to the full House or Senate floor for vote. And there were some of the bills I was following, there were like 4 of those bills that got all the way to rules, but then never got put to the floor for a vote. Now, is it because this is the first of the 2-year period, in the next session, are those still in rules? Like, could they be acted on and moved to floor vote without having to go back to a policy or fiscal committee for the next session?
That's a really good question. My understanding is that things that haven't been, and I'm going to look sort of, you can't tell through the camera, both Enoka and Sarah, because I know you know a lot of this as well. But my understanding is that if it hasn't been voted down, essentially, if it hasn't been like officially killed, it can be resurrected. And often where it is in the process, if it's sitting in rules, I think it can be resurrected from that spot to be considered again in the next session. But then that means that that sort of period, the interim between sessions and whatnot, is also when everything has to be, a lot of work has to be done to make sure that it actually gets scheduled, that it doesn't then die a sort of complete death at that point. Does that sound right? I said, glancing at my co-conspirators. Any other questions that we want to go through? By the way, welcome, Louise, and thanks for joining us, Enoka. We're going to be jumping through these sort of topics of like some 101, and then we're going to hit some review. So that's like an overview of the calendar, and it's one of those things that you get more and more comfortable the more you interact with it. Something to note about the rules committee is that if I understand correctly, this is something that I'm still like wrapping my brain around, the rules committee, it's a different kind of committee than like transportation or public safety or something like that, because they're really determining, they're kind of the agenda setters, right? The rules committee is really what sets the agenda. So when we say this has to go from its opposite house, from its house of origin to the opposite house, going through rules is sort of that process where it gets on the agenda for any kind of consideration at its next stop, as opposed to other committees that are really digging into the substance of a bill from a policy perspective on, well, this is a transportation bill, so we're looking at it from how does this affect streets, or how does this affect safety, or whatever. And it can be a little bit confusing because sometimes, because we have all these stops along the way, all these committees that you have to get through, I'm going to invite you to say more on that in a second, Enoka. Because of all these things you have to get through, there are lots of opportunities for bills to be killed or to die, where the procedure becomes more than procedure, where it becomes the way by which an agenda either advances or fails. Enoka said in chat, rules is entirely political, which is fair, even if in theory it's agenda setting. Do you want to say more on that?
I think at that point it's been vetted by the policy committee, by the fiscal committee, and it really is sort of a political decision. Rules is made up of leadership, and I think they're trying to weigh, does it have the votes in the caucus? Does it have, how much floor time is it going to eat up, and what does that mean for other bills? How many amendments is the minority party going to put on to try to kill it? I think they're weighing all of those sort of political decisions in rules, and that's why things get pulled or don't get pulled. But yeah, that's the part. I'm a policy person, so I hate rules. It makes the least sense to me.
The committee, not the concept. Yeah. I mean, he who sets the agenda has the power, or she. So that's the reality of that. I'm going to jump back, barring any questions. I'm going to leave a moment, see if we've got any questions real quick. All right, I'm going to jump back to the PowerPoint real quick. And let's share screen again. The second thing that I wanted to mention were the versions. So when we looked at the calendar, this is something that I didn't really truly understand until I was doing some of this work myself. Have you ever gotten, let me back up and ask a question. Have you ever gotten an email from an organization that you trust, and they said, we really 100% support HB 1234. Call your senator, let them know that we're for it. And then 2 weeks later, you get a different email that says, we are absolutely opposed to HB 1234. Call so-and-so and let them know, and sign in con here to let them know that we don't want it. Has that ever happened to anybody, or has anyone ever experienced that? I see some nods. I see some potential confusion. There's a reason for this. And the biggest reason, essentially, is that at every stop that we mentioned, at every stop where where it's moving between houses or in or out of committee, that is an opportunity for the lawmakers to make changes. Sometimes those changes preserve the spirit of a bill, sometimes they don't. Sometimes those changes include everything that was wanted and make it better. Sometimes those changes really flip the theory behind the bill of what needed to happen in order to solve the community problem. So it's one of those things where we could be essentially looking at a bill and say, this is a great concept, this is beautiful, it was vetted through this policy committee, we think it's done everything that it needs to do, this is fantastic. And then it moves maybe through its entire, maybe it even gets to the next house in that form. And then they take a look at it. And what comes out of their committee process is something that doesn't look anything like what the previous house put together. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, this bill is poison. This bill is, the spirit of it has been completely changed. So something that you may notice, if you ever get confused in the numbers, is that there are multiple versions of bills. And that's one of the things that I always want to emphasize for folks, is that the bill that we start with isn't always the bill that we end with. And that's an important reason why you may get told this thing is great and then told this thing is trash later, or even we've gone from pro to neutral, or we've gone from neutral to anti, based on however it's been altered. The final little bit of 101 that I wanted to share with folks before we sort of dive into what happened this session is the concept of interim, right? The interim between sessions, the time between legislative sessions when a lot of work and a lot of lobbying happens. What a lot of people don't necessarily realize, and I also invite comments from anyone who's experienced this, is that the time between sessions is when so much work happens. If you're looking at it from the outside, I know my experience when I was just somebody who was really deeply plugged into an organization was that I would get these emails that would say, sign in here and do this there and call this person. And there'd be like, either a month and a half to 3.5 months of just intense activity, writing emails, making phone calls, talking to folks. And what I didn't realize was that so much groundwork had been laid in advance to make sure that there was already a base to support or oppose a certain set of legislation. That interim time, that time in between, is when so much education of the public happens, so they're primed to get behind something, education of legislators, so that they might be able to come at it from the perspective that we need them to come at to take the vote we need them to take. It's really insane the way we expect legislators to get a bill one day on a topic they may not know a whole lot about, become an expert, and then vote on it in just a couple months. And if they only had that time to do it, it would be completely irresponsible. But the fact is, in many ways, they're working all year, every year. And in that interim period is often when they return to their districts. So in this case, I live in Legislative District 3. So my state representative is Marcus Riccelli, and he comes back to Spokane and he meets people and he has coffees and he talks to people and he gets to know, different interest groups, different donors, has town halls, connects with the public more. Those are the times when we really can exert a different kind of influence, where maybe they aren't taking a vote tomorrow, but they can get educated so that when that vote rolls around next year, or next session rather, they're ready. So those are kind of the 3 things. We talked about the calendar, we talked about versions, and we talked about interim. Any questions or anything that people want to chime in, either as information or just to make sure we got a solid hold before we move forward? What's up, Joanne?
So with this interim, what I can see is that our representatives are just working nonstop during the session. So it's like, when do people start trying to, begin conversations? I mean, is there typically you let people have like a week or 2 off after the session? And then because a lot of these people they have to have a second job because they don't get paid enough to this be their full-time job. So maybe I'll just learn more, but I am confused about when and are these people required to meet with us? Because they have jobs. So
yeah, that's a really good question. So the really short answer essentially is that no one is required. Let me start at the end. No one's required to meet with any individual, right? No representative is required to meet with any individual constituent. But if they want to have a good relationship with their district and be reelected, it's to their benefit to listen to their folks, right? To come back and have conversations and whatnot. I believe technically interim begins, whenever the House is in recess. So right now, the last day of session, the last day allowed for regular session under the state constitution is this year's April 23rd, which is Sunday. It'll be the 105th day of session. So it's a long session, as we call it. And after that, a lot of representatives will go on vacations or do other things. They will make the time to be away from the job. So if you want to talk to someone and you want to talk to them during that in-between period, don't worry about their schedule. That's what their assistants are for. They'll tell you when they're available and they'll make time for you. Go ahead and call them and say, hey, when you're back in town, I would love to have a conversation with you. And you send an email or you make a phone call if you've got that kind of relationship with them, and you get on their calendar. And then it's on them to set the boundaries and make sure they get a break or a vacation, just kind of like the rest of us. They do often have second jobs. And I don't always know how it all works. I know Marcus Riccelli works for Chaz, and we see him all over town, and he coaches one of his kids' soccer teams, or he did last session. Like, he's an active guy. But everybody's different. Mostly it's just important to know when an interim is, to sort of know when they're done with the intense vote-taking part of their job. Any other comments, questions before we keep going? All righty. I apologize a little bit to Enoka, because I know you were joining us late when I thought we'd be starting your section. So I hope you don't mind being here for a little bit of the run-up. The next thing that I want to, hit is, what is the PJALS agenda, and then what happened to it, right? And the what happened to it is why we have a couple of special guests with us today. But let's start with what it even was. So let's see, get back to sharing. The Peace and Justice League's legislative agenda every year is guided by a couple of things. The first one is the latest results of our member survey. We send out member surveys, sometimes always online, and sometimes I believe we do some other mail copies to people who don't have online access every 2 years. And we get back a list of priorities from our folks. And those priorities guide our legislative agenda. We don't do a lot of, I would say, original work in terms of creating coalitions around bills or things like that. Instead, we've opted to be a part of coalitions across the state that work on things that we care about. And then if somebody spots something either on staff or within those coalitions that we say, oh, we should really be on top of this, then we might jump on how we support that particular bill. But often there are organizations that work on just transportation issues, or just police accountability, or just healthcare. And we try to make sure that we engage with the coalitions that support the values of our membership. So we use a 2-tier system to figure out what we want to do. Tier 1 is made up of bills that we actively seek to promote. That is the staff, that we spend staff hours. That's my time, that's Executive Director Liz Moore's time, that's any other organizers that we have on staff, like the youth organizer or anything like that. We use our time to try and promote that. And we not only collaborate with allies, but we'll plan our own events and invite others to join in. We'll say, hey, there's a lot of work happening around this. I bet we could host a rally. I bet we could host a march. I bet we could host a legislative action hour. And then tier 2 is legislation that's still very important to us, but that we support primarily through things that are adding on. We're not creating original events, but we are going to sign on to letters, make statements, and participate in efforts led by other partners. We have to make sure, and I don't know why there's a typo here. Let's just fix that right now. We have to make sure that we are responsibly using everyone's time. And so sometimes, so we kind of rank tier 1 and tier 2, and it doesn't mean that the tier 2 issues aren't important. It means that we have one organizer on staff. And, we got to do what we got to do. All of these priorities reflect our values of racial and economic justice, decriminalizing poverty, and ending racism in our carceral legal system statewide, which are the high points of the priorities that came out of our last biennial member survey. So a quick review. Tier 1 legislation this last session was pulled from the priorities of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability, the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance, Tenants Union of Washington, the Free to Walk Coalition, and the Drug Decriminalization Coalition. And here's just a list of some of the bills that we either did some events around or otherwise supported events around. There was Traffic Safety for All, or House Bill 1513, Access to Fairness, or House Bill 1025, investigation and AG investigation reform, independent prosecutor for police use of deadly force. There were bills in both chambers to end jaywalking laws in Washington state. We also supported legislation to invest in homeless prevention, invest in eviction prevention to prevent homelessness, and prevent unfair, abusive, and extreme rent increases. You'll notice that there's many topics here as there are bill numbers, because sometimes things pop up and sometimes they don't, and sometimes concepts are floating in the ether or in a chamber for a while before they become the thing. But we knew from the beginning that these were issues that were going to be tackled during the long session, so we took time for them. Tier 2, and here you see the logos of all the organizations that we partnered with or worked with, collaborated with in some way, shape, or form. that were listed earlier. You can see their logos. But tier 2 basically was the entire agenda of Washington Coalition for Police Accountability, Washington Low Income Housing Alliance, but also Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington, North Idaho, as well as 10th Union of Washington, where we said, hey, maybe we only picked a couple of your bills for our tier 1, but everything you're doing fits tier 2. You've got a sign-on letter for this, we'll sign it. You have links so that we can sign on pro or con, we're in. You have social media posts you want us to boost, we'll do it. Because everything that you've outlined as a priority for this year is stuff that we want to support and lend our voice to. So with that, let's talk about what happened. And Enoka, you're up. Enoka Herat, Enoka Herat is the Police Practices and Immigration Council at the ACLU of Washington and played a role in really working on a lot of these bills. I saw or heard her in so many meetings. So I will let you take it away for a bit of an update. And would you like me to leave the screen share up or take it down?
You can leave it up either way, whatever you prefer. But yes, thank you so much for having me here, and I'm happy to answer questions if they come up. But these were, and by way of introduction, my name is Enoka. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Police Practices and Immigration Council at the ACLU of Washington. And so my focus this session was on these 3 policing bills, and I worked really closely with Pajals and Washington Coalition for Police Accountability and many other allies on them. And traffic safety for all, this is the bill that I was sort of the most excited about this session. It's HB 1513. The prime sponsor of that was Rep. Chapalo Street, who's actually my representative in the 37th district over here in Seattle. That is a bill that seeks to prevent and reduce police violence by addressing traffic stops and low-level traffic stops and really trying to prioritize safety risk in traffic stops, because that's where resources should be geared towards. And those safety-related stops is not where we see the kind of racial disparity, the kind of targeting of low-income road users, et cetera. The traffic safety bill also provided a sort of a community fund that would be housed at a state agency where jurisdictions from across the state could apply for grants to help low-income drivers get into compliance with some of the low risks, like equipment violation kind of stops. So, repair orders if you have a taillight out, or fee waivers if you have, for expired tabs, since tabs can be so expensive. And those kinds of things, again, to sort of shift the focus away from punishment and punitive enforcement and more fees and fines, and instead try to fix the problem and get safer cars and more safety on the roads in general. And that bill had a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of community support for it, and also a lot of support from lawmakers. And it was at one point a Democratic priority, is what we heard from leadership. And so it was able to move through policy committee, the Community Safety and Justice and Reentry committee, as well as a transportation committee. And then it got stuck in rules. And this bill in particular, I think, got caught up with policing rollback bill known as the vehicle pursuit bill. And there were, some of the moderate Democrats wanted to roll back police reform bill and wanted to do something like expanding when officers can engage in vehicle pursuits, but then the progressives and other Democrats wanted to engage in police reform with something like the traffic safety for all bill. And there was just this real conflict. And there was even an attempt in rules to create sort of like a Frankenstein bill that combined that bad bill with this good bill to see whether it could bring all the Democrats along. And at the end of the day, the progressives were like, we're not going to vote for the vehicle pursuit rollback. We refuse, And so the bill ended up dying. It didn't get past that House floor vote policy cutoff or floor cutoff, like Jack had mentioned. But there's a lot of momentum for it. And this is a really transformative bill. I mean, this would impact tens of thousands of traffic stops across our state each month. And so to see it in its first session get so far is still really hopeful. And I think it has a really broad coalition. And I think that'll continue in the interim, and we'll just continue doing education for lawmakers and hope to push it out of rules next session.
That's awesome. And Enoka, I'm going to stop share for a second so people can see your face when I ask this. You've used the phrase first session, like in a really sort of common way. Can you explain why you put it that way?
Sure. So there was other attempts at addressing, sort of reducing the role of police in these like low risk stops, but it was just sort of a floated idea in the past. But this is the first session that this bill, as it's drafted with these sort of different components, it also has a data collection component. We worked with so many stakeholders last interim to really construct the policy on this and to really sort of thread some needles and make sure it addressed public safety needs as well as sort of racial justice needs. And so it's really the first time that policy, this is the first session, and is the first session in a biennium, that this policy has been sort of out, in the legislature.
And is it common for bills like this to take multiple sessions to pass if they make it as far as something like this did?
It's a big transformative bill. So yes, I mean, we had a transformative immigration bill, the Keep Washington Working Act, which passed a few years ago. That took 9 years, 9 sessions to pass, and so sometimes the politics will give headwind to it, some years there is an appetite for more police reform or something like that, but otherwise it is just sort of a slog in keeping up the education, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. So what do you want people to know or do in the meantime, now that it's sitting in rules? We're hoping it'll be able to push out next session. What should the common people who don't do this for a living be aware of, and how can maybe they help with the situation?
I think for this and for all the bills, reaching out to lawmakers during the interim is really important. They remember constituents, they remember stories they've told, they remember their concerns. And so just raising those concerns and keeping it on the radar is just incredibly important. If that's just shooting an email to your lawmaker, or doing something like a letter to the editor, or or an op-ed or anything like that, any sort of effort, tweeting about it, posting about it, all that matters. It really does. It keeps it on people's minds and on the radar.
Awesome. I know you've got some kind of limited time, but do you want to provide kind of the quick status report of the other two bills that we were talking about real quick? We've got access to fairness and Attorney General investigations and reform.
Sure, yeah, and those will be quicker. So Access to Fairness Act is HB 1025. This is by Rep. Ty. This would be the third year that bill is in front of the legislature, in largely the same format, although it's been tweaked here and there. But that bill would make it easier for victims of police misconduct to sue police officers and departments when their constitutional rights have been violated by an officer, without the shield of qualified immunity, which is a legal doctrine that exists right now and really does shield officers from accountability for even the most sort of egregious acts of misconduct. And so that bill also made it all the way to rules and died in rules. And for that bill, it's always been a really uphill battle, because the Association of Washington Cities and cities across the state are concerned that this is going to result in more litigation and it's going to cost cities more. And, of course, our response to that is like, well, tell your police officers to stop hurting people and follow the Constitution, and then you wouldn't have increased liability.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there is sort of this idea that it's easier to control the liability than it is to control the police. And so there has just been pushback because of those sort of financial reasons.
I'm going to interrupt you real quick because you mentioned the Association of Washington Cities. And I think something that a lot of people don't know, or at least that I didn't know until recently, and by recently, I mean like within the last couple of years, is that cities have lobbyists that they send to the legislature. So like there's somebody who's employed by the city of Spokane to be a lobbyist. There's likely someone who's employed by the city wherever you live, if you live in a city of any size, who send someone to the state legislature who's there to go to the state legislature, and their job isn't just to do the things that we might think, like lobby them for more funding for roads, or ask them if they can invest more in a particular industry that's important to the area. That's what people often think of when they think of lobbyists for the city. If they know the city had lobbyists at all, what's important to know is that that person's job isn't to serve the people of the city. It's to serve the entity, the administration of that city. So when a lobbyist goes up to Olympia on behalf of the city of Spokane and says, please don't pass this bill that will increase our liability if we hold police accountable in the courts, they're not doing that for you and me. They're doing that on behalf of an administration that's going, ooh, we might have to pay through the nose if we don't have a legal shield that prevents our police from being held accountable in this particular way. Of course, you can hear my positions, and I'll name my bias, right, towards this bill, for this bill, because this is a bill that Pajaus really cared about, and a bill that a lot of organizations across the state really cared about. What that also means is that that's another pressure point. We can pressure our cities where we live. We don't have to wait for the next session to come around for this bill to come up. We can say, hey, we know you're going up to Olympia, and saying, don't pass this. Why are you doing that? We can put pressure on our locals and never fall for the idea, oh, well, we don't decide that. Olympia decides that. Don't fall for it. Ask them, about, is my city represented, a part of the Association of Washington Cities? Ask them, go look up who is the lobbyist for this city. Talk to your city council president, or depending on the structure of your government, your mayor, and say, hey, who sets the agenda for the lobbyist we send to Olympia? I know that someone does, right? And when you talk to that person, you find out what they're having them say, because they will often shuffle up onto the state things that they have actively tried to prevent or promote from their local seat. So I just wanted to name that real quick.
Oh, that's great, Jack. I mean, I think that's so true. And Spokane is an example where City Council member Brian Beggs testified in support of this bill very persuasively. And, the lobbyist for Spokane could represent the mayor, which is a very different perspective. So yeah, doing that kind of advocacy at the city level, I think that is definitely a place that we need to explore during interim on this bill.
I'm going to throw up the thing again so we can look at the last one.
Yes, that's right. HB 1445 was Attorney General Investigations and Reform Bill. And what this really is it would clarify the Washington State Attorney General's office, their authority, and expand their authority to investigate and bring a case against a department in Washington State. So, and both a police department or a sheriff's office, but also the jails, a county jail. If there are constitutional violations or violations of state law happening there. And this is sort of like a backstop. It's kind of like a guardrail where there are departments where it's not a particular officer or a particular incident, but really sort of there's something wrong at the department level. There's a lack of discipline throughout, or there's discriminatory policing. This is similar to sort of the pattern practice cases that the U.S. Department of Justice brings, and where there are consent decrees and things like that. And so it would give more authority and more resources to our state attorney general to do that. And Rep. Hansen was the prime sponsor of this bill. This is the first session that's been sort of a standalone bill. And that was also, it didn't really have a lot of opposition. I think that was one, it ended up being in rules, and Rep. Hansen as a prime sponsor ended up having COVID at the last few days before that cutoff. And I think it just sort of fell through the cracks, and it was just, that's life. But actually there was a lot of support for that. So I do, of the policing bills, in some ways that was almost the easiest bill, even though I think it will have some of that systemic change, but hoping that'll move forward.
And can you say, you said before that cutoff, can you define which cutoff it was that this bill kind of fell off at?
Oh, all of them died. All three of those bills died at the House of Origin cutoff. So none of them got floor votes, unfortunately.
In some ways, it's a good thing, because if they didn't get floor votes, that means they didn't get voted down.
That's true.
Which means that they get resurrected at the same point in the process, correct? Next go around.
They should, yeah.
All right. And then they have to go through the process again with the policy committee and the rules committee of the opposite house. That's
right. And these all started in the House, where we think there's more support for for policing reform, and the Senate tends to be a little bit more moderate. And so we will see, but that will be the challenge for next year.
All right. Thank you so much, Enoka.
Thank you all so much. If there's any other questions. All right. Well, thank you so much. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Bye.
All right. Next up, I know there's a lot to digest, and I will be sharing this slide deck and hopefully a version of this recording soon so that we can all see it and folks can kind of learn from this. Next up, though, we've got Sarah Dixit. If you want to take a little time talking about what Planned Parenthood's agenda looked like, this was something that helped occupy our Tier 2 priorities. Sarah Dixit is the Public Affairs Manager at Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington and North Idaho. Had the pleasure of working with her both at Planned Parenthood and outside of Planned Parenthood for several years now. So fantastic colleague. And do you want to just kind of walk us through what happened with these bills?
Yeah, hi everyone. As Jack said, my name is Sarah Dixit. My pronouns are she, her. I'm based in Spokane. And this year we have been pretty successful with our bills, which is really great. So hopefully ending on a higher note. So basically this year has been just really imperative that we make Washington as safe as possible when it comes to reproductive health care because of what is happening across the nation post the Dobbs decision last June. So this is the first legislative session since then. So basically just trying to either respond to a lot of things that happened since last session in a lot of states, or anticipate what is needed in the future, since all of this is very new in terms of like
Post-Roe world.
Since Roe was not the law of the land. So having to anticipate what future issues will be. So the priorities that we had, the first one being no cost sharing for abortion. So this would limit out-of-pocket costs for patients, including prohibiting copays for abortion. So basically helping when it comes to the cost that patients will have to pay out of pocket when it comes to abortion care, trying to minimize what that amount looks like. Because we know that cost is a big issue, right? Especially if someone is having to travel a long distance, have rent to pay, food to put on the table, all these things. We just didn't want them seeking healthcare to be another burden that they are paying for. So this one is moving, and this is currently scheduled for public hearing in the House Committee on Appropriations at 1:30 on Thursday, March 30th. So it's moving.
And to be clear, that means it's gotten through its whole House of Origin process and is now in the opposite house going through the cycle. Great.
Yeah. So the second one, My Health, My Data. This one was one that the Attorney General's office actually pushed for the legislature to essentially have a sponsor to take this bill. And this would limit the collection, sharing, and selling of health data that is not protected by HIPAA. So HIPAA is the policy that protects a lot of our health data when it comes to our patient visits. If you go to your primary care doctor, your dentist, whatever, HIPAA is what protects that data to make sure that people don't know the healthcare you're receiving. There's no personal identification attached to the care you're getting. But what we've seen is that places like crisis pregnancy centers, which are not actual medical facilities, can collect your data and use it however they want because they're not under HIPAA compliance. And we know that this is a big issue post-Roe because there is just a lot of states out there that are wanting to investigate and prosecute providers and patients. So if we can limit the collection and sharing of people's data, we can prevent, or hopefully try to prevent, that data then being used against them in future litigation, if that's what ends up happening.
So just to clarify this, because I didn't actually know this until this year, HIPAA is a law or a policy that follows medical institutions, not the actual data. So it's not
Yes.
that your data is protected on its own, it's that medical institutions have to abide by certain rules.
Yeah.
But if you're not one of those places and you access that data, like if you're a crisis pregnancy center, quote unquote, or one of these places that gets a lot of health information, they can kind of do whatever they want with your data because HIPAA doesn't apply to them. They're not medical institutions.
Yeah. And if you remember back when the leak of the Dobbs decision happened in May and the final decision in June, there was a lot of questions about like period tracking apps of what does that look like, right? Because a period app is not a medical, institution or anything like that. So how is that data being used? So it essentially just addresses some of those issues that came up when people were just really freaking out about the Dobbs decision. So trying to do as much as we can to limit that sharing of the data, so that people are aware of when sites are using their data and how and collecting so that they can either opt in or opt out. And so this one is currently waiting for its second reading by Rules Committee. So it passed through the House, now is in the Senate. So it's moving, which
So it
is
has to
great.
be scheduled for a vote then? That's the last step? All right. Awesome.
And then the next one is protecting providers and patients, which is a SHIELD law. So this would protect providers and patients who provide or receive abortion or gender affirming care within Washington borders from other states wanting to criminalize and prosecute. So our neighbor is Idaho. So this is a really, really important bill. And especially with Idaho, I think just today had passed a ban on minors receiving gender affirming care. So it's important to pay attention to and make sure that we pass through Washington State. And this one is scheduled for public hearing in the Senate Committee on Ways and Means at 12:30 on Thursday, on the 30th. So also moving, which is great. And the last one is also trying to address the big issue of provider licensing. So with the bills that other states are pushing, one of the risks that a lot of our providers are seeing is potentially having their licenses revoked. So this would protect the providers in Washington State from having that happen, because as other states are wanting to punish providers for providing abortion and gender affirming care. This one is sponsored by our very own Marcus Riccelli, so we love that. And it passed to Rules Committee for a second reading, so we're just waiting for that.
And do you want to clarify for a second? I'm going to stop share real quick now that we've gone through them. Do you mind clarifying what you mean when you say second reading?
Yeah, so basically it just means that it's gone through and it's just waiting to be pulled, essentially. So hopefully that happens.
If I understand correctly, I'm going to just make sure that I have this right. The rules are that a bill has to be, there's like a first reading that's almost ceremonial that says, hey, this House can consider this, we're going to talk about this. And it's only after the second reading that it can be voted on, correct?
Yes.
So they have to consider it. When we talk about first reading or second reading is the point at which a bill sort of introduced its debut. And then the second reading is when a decision can be made by the voting body at that moment.
Yeah,
and that's basically to ensure that something can't just be sprung on the agenda, read once and voted on instantly. It's meant to offer time for consideration, etc.
Yes, yeah. So it's typically where you might see more debate or some amendments being added. So that's where you want to like pay attention to make sure it doesn't, have anything put on it that makes it wildly different or defeats the purpose of the bill entirely. And the only other bill we had was Keeping Our Care Act, which was essentially an accountability bill for the hospital mergers that we're seeing in our areas. So essentially providing more oversight over which hospitals are being bought up, especially because a lot of them are religious institutions. So it has a huge impact on the care that people can receive. So that one unfortunately died, and it was the second year we've tried it. So, but it made it further this year than last year. So we're going to try again next year and hopefully it'll make it through. But yeah, otherwise we have budget requests or budget asks. But if any of you looked at the revenue forecast, it's not looking great, but we're still going to try to ask the state for some funds so that we can help just support the abortion provider network and for patients seeking care here from out of state.
Anyone have any questions about the status of those bills and what's happened, and or any just process questions in general for me or Sarah?
I just want to say congratulations. Having 4 of them still alive is awesome.
I know. Yeah. I think definitely it's helpful. And, you know, it's one of those things where once something's put on a national stage, people are like, we got to do something. So it's unfortunate that it took something like Roe being overturned, but we're glad that our legislators are taking it seriously.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Mhm.
I don't know if you have to peace out, but I'm going to ask you one more question before you're sort of released to do whatever it is that you would like to be doing. That is, are there any actions that people can take in the right now, since 4 of these bills are alive, and one of them will be cycling back hopefully next session? Is there anything that people can do to support these bills right now, or a place where they could go to see updates to find out what they can do and support?
Yeah, I can drop my email in the chat, and I'm trying to pull up. We have a petition.
And is it cool if I share this email when I share it out with our wider audience? Awesome.
Yes, for sure. Let me restart. Sometimes Teams hates me, and just restart it all. But we have a petition for folks if they want to take action that way.
Sorry, could you say that one more time?
Yes, we have. Yes, I'm going to drop it in the chat.
Awesome. Okay. And what's this petition for?
It's essentially contacting our legislators and the governor's office for the budget requests that we have. Okay.
Asking for more funding to enable the kind of care that's provided by Planned Parenthood to continue and to provide for the influx of people we've got flooding into this region from Idaho and other places, right?
Essentially, yeah. So it has like operating budget, which will allow providers to invest in recruitment and retention strategies, because the issue we're seeing is that a lot of providers, based on just like the strong risk that there is associated by being an abortion and gender affirming care provider, is how do we make sure folks who want to be doing this work but are maybe a little hesitant have resources to, you know, be retained in those positions or be trained in those things or certified and whatever else. Yeah, because we're definitely losing a lot of providers.
People are afraid for their livelihoods or their. Well, thank you so much for doing that really important work. Really appreciate you coming here, especially, y'all don't know this, but Sarah's being a pinch hitter right now. Coming in at the clutch at the last moment to help provide this information. So much appreciation.
Of course. Yeah. And I'll type in my email and then I'm going to go because I have to lock up the office.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.
And while she's doing that, I'll just read this aloud for the recording. That's sarah.dixit@ppgwni.org. That's again, Sarah with an H, period, and then DIXIT at ppgwni for Planned Parenthood of Greater Washington and North Idaho.org. For anyone listening. So with that, cheers. We have about 10 minutes left. And so what I'd love to ask, and of course, we're going to share this information, going to share the petition and the contact information that's approved to share and sort of the statuses, this recording and whatnot. But as we are sort of wrapping up, I kind of have like a little bit of a closing statement, and then I want to see if there are any other questions or debrief things that people want to talk about for the next 10 minutes. My sort of closing bit is that a lot of times in the past, organizations like PJALs that depend upon their members to really be the people power behind all the work that we do, and who don't necessarily have dedicated lobbying staff, but have organizers who try to figure out how to focus the desires of membership towards the legislation that will move us towards our values as a society, oftentimes we only activate folks during the session itself. And what I realized that meant was that we were missing out on some session education. We were missing out on interim agitation. We were missing out on letting people know all the other ways that they could talk to their city, talk to their representatives, their electeds, and apply pressure to make sure that things happen. People also often have this notion that bills live and die in one session and that's it. And some do, but so many others just keep coming back and back and back. And, you know, something might take 9 sessions, like Enoka mentioned, to pass, but they do. Or there are things that are in their second or third session, and we keep pushing in the in-between. So I guess I wanted to provide that hope, because if you were following a lot of police accountability legislation, you might have found this to be a very discouraging session. Whereas if you were following this from a reproductive rights perspective, you might have found this to be a very encouraging session. And if it was housing, it might have been something in between, where you felt like, oh, we got something, but not what we wanted. So I just wanted to provide that context and really encourage folks to consider the in-between time, the interim, and the real scope of work that these bills take and our role as civic individuals in it. This process isn't made for everyday people to just jump in, but with a little bit of education, we can all seize a bit more power back sort of from what can be a very opaque system. With that, any questions, comments, debrief notes, things people want to say before we call it an evening?
I just wanted to comment, Jack, that I really appreciate you setting this up. It's been quite an education for me, and I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for coming. All right. Well, in that case, have a good evening, everyone, and have a good rest of your week. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.